Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank my good friend from the great state of Mississippi, who's been a fantastic leader on the Armed Services Committee, fantastic leader on so many of these important national security topics, and he and I share a very strong, similar, identical view on the importance of Taiwan, and we all need to be doing that. So I want to thank my good friend, Senator Wicker from Mississippi, for his leadership on this and so many other issues. I also want to thank my good friend from Alaska, Senator Murkowski, who was just on the floor of the U.S. Senate talking about the importance of the Willow project, not just to Alaska, but to America. She and I are going to be down here on the floor a lot in the next several weeks. I was here last week talking about this project. Now, for those of you who haven't watched, a quick recap of the Willow project, a very large-scale oil and gas project in the National Petroleum Reserve of Alaska, so not a controversial area at all. It's not like ANWR or some of the other areas in our state. NPRA, as we call it in Alaska, was set aside by the federal government decades ago for oil and gas development, okay, because we need oil and gas. We need it. Some people out there don't think we do, but we do, and if we need it, we should do it in America. Mr. President, just a quick little summary of some of the key aspects of this. 2,500 jobs to build this, ready to build tomorrow if we got permission. Completely shovel-ready. 75% of those jobs will be union jobs, building trades jobs. It's one of the top priorities of unions. I'm going to talk about that. Peak production, almost 200,000 barrels a day. Highest environmental standards in the world by far. Lowest greenhouse gas emissions of a major energy project in the world by far. Billions in revenues from the federal government, for state government, for local governments in Alaska, and broad-based support from every group in Alaska you can imagine, Mr. President. So, that's the Willow project. We got the final EIS last week, and the Biden administration is still kind of saying, maybe we're going to narrow this so much that we're going to kill it. And I'm going to talk about that. That would be unbelievable. I've tried to work with this administration. Certainly Senator Murkowski has. We have made this the #1 issue from the Alaska delegation ever since Joe Biden stepped into office on day one. I've personally raised this with the president, every cabinet official. Willow is #1. You want cooperation from the Alaska delegation, you got to work with us, okay? We're there. We're almost there. But I want to talk about some of what happened last week, Mr. President, because our good friends in the media, who love to write about this story, Willow, because they hate the project, they're biased in the project. So when the EIS came out last week, if you read the national media, which there was a lot of, guess who they quote, Mr. President? Guess who they quote? Think they quote the Alaskans who want it, the Native people, the indigenous people in my state who really want it? The unions? No. No, no, no. Our national media, our friends in national media, they never quote them. They quote Greenpeace, Center for Biological Diversity. Who are the other radical groups? Earth Justice. Okay, all the far left radical groups, none of whom live in Alaska, by the way, they get fully quoted, climate bomb, all this crazy stuff that's not scientific based at all. But they don't quote people, in my view, who really, really matter. Who really, really matter. Particularly the Native people. You want to talk about racial justice? You want to talk about environmental justice? You want to talk about racial equity? Buzzwords the Biden administration uses all the time. The media does too. But somehow they always leave out the indigenous people of my state. It's wrong, Mr. President. It is wrong. Media is wrong. Biden administration is wrong. I'm going to go into this in a big way. But I just want to make one final point. When people talk about the science, the Democrats, we're the party of science. What happened last week was the final EIS came out. And that was the career staff at the federal agencies who came out with this final environmental impact statement. Okay? It wasn't great. It limited this project from 5 pads, which is where the Trump administration, their record of decision, concluded, based on science, that you could do this environmentally, in an environmentally sensitive way. The Biden administration came out and said, no, we're going to move it to 3 pads. All right, that's the career staff. We could live with that. The private sector company, ConocoPhillips, could live with that. Native people could live with that. We have 30 days. If you're an American who cares about energy security, national security, weigh in with BLM.gov, Department of Interior, say, we got to get the Willow project over the goal line. Mr. President, if this gets limited beyond that, it's pure politics. Pure politics. The Democrats, party of science, okay, prove it. If this gets limited more, it's going to kill the project. We know every far-left environmental group in the country, just read the paper, last week they said, we are out to kill this thing. If this gets killed, it'll be pure politics by Joe Biden, John Podesta, the whole group in the White House. So, the Native people are very upset in my state because overwhelmingly they support this. Every major Native Alaskan group in the country supports this. And, Mr. President, they can't get one quote in the newspaper. The Washington Post, forget it. They won't quote a Native Alaskan who supports it. They find the one who's against it and quote her. But the vast majority support it. This is the voice of the Arctic Inupiaq. They put this statement out a couple weeks ago. I'm just going to read it again. Outside activist groups, that's the ones that always get quoted in the newspaper. You know the ones, Center for Biological Diversity, Greenpeace, Thirst Justice. By the way, Center for American Progress, interesting about them. They're really against it. Now, why is that so interesting? That was started by John Podesta. Until recently, he was the leader of it. They put statements out against Willow all the time. Now he's in charge of making the decision on whether Willow should go forward. Is that fair? Boy, I hope he's being objective. Imagine if the shoe was on the other foot. I won't even describe what that would look like. So all these groups, they're always against it. But here's the Native people who want it. And I'm explaining for a minute why they want it. So they said outside activist groups opposing Willow have drowned out, certainly in the media, our local perspectives and are actively working to supersede the views of the Alaska Native people. True. By the way, the media, sorry guys, but you're helping them in a great way to cancel the voices of the Native people. This is not environmental justice or any other kind of justice, certainly not racial equity. It's racial cancelization. I'm continuing. And it is a direct attack on Alaska Native self-determination. Okay? So that's going on right now. And it's very frustrating. It's very frustrating, Mr. President, because the voices of some amazing people in my state, the indigenous people of Alaska, are being canceled and drowned out. And our national media has no problem quoting in every story the far-left radical enviros who want to shut down every energy project in America, and they won't quote these great people. So why do they care about this project so much? Well, it's jobs, it's energy, it's revenues, but you know what? It's even bigger than that. Here's why they care. Mr. President, I break out this chart a lot. I'm going to explain it here. This is a chart from the American Medical Association. And what it does, it looks at the changes in life expectancy in America from 1980 to 2014, a 25-year period. Now, look, we're all Americans. We want progress. Where you see anywhere kind of yellow, then green, then blue, then dark blue, then purple, that's good in our country. that means people's life expectancy is increasing. All right, we all want that. We all want that. Now, unfortunately, you see like orange and red, a couple spots in America, orange, red. That's actually American life expectancies in the last 25 years decreasing. Nobody wants that. This is another topic, Mr. President, but that's primarily parts of the country that were hit really hard by the opioid epidemic. Okay, we got to work together to improve it. We don't want to see any orange or red here. Nobody wants an American's life expectancy to decrease. That's bad. Okay, but here's my broader point, Mr. President. What part of America had the biggest life expectancy increase from 1980 to 2014? Increase. My state. Great state of Alaska. You look at this map, life expectancy, particularly in the rural areas, the native areas, native villages, Aleutian Island chain, parts of the Southeast, life expectancy went up 5, 6, 7, Mr. President, up to 13 years. 13 years, highest in the country. That's great. That's great. As I've said to many folks when we've been debating these issues here on the Senate floor, give me one indicator of policy success more important than are your citizens living longer? I've never heard anyone come back to me and say, here's something more important, Dan. Okay? I don't think there is. So from 1980 to 2014, there are big swaths of Alaska where the life expectancy went like this. That's great. We should all celebrate that. Why did that happen, Mr. President? Why did that happen? I'll tell you why it happened. You had major resource development here. You had Prudhoe Bay, the development of Prudhoe Bay, the biggest oil and gas field in North America, other oil and gas fields. You had the development of the Aleutian Island chain with the Magnuson-Stevens Act for resource development on fisheries. Huge legislative change. So you had mining. You had resource development, which was jobs and revenues. And all of a sudden, these communities were able to get things like clinics and flush toilets and running water and gymnasiums. Things that in the lower 48, in New Jersey or other places, you just take for granted. Well, we didn't have them there. And because we had jobs and resource development and an economy, you started having that, and you have people living longer. So, Mr. President, I think you're hopefully seeing the point. This Willow project is a matter of life and death for my constituents. And that's why almost everybody, the Alaska Federation of Natives, every native group, every group in Alaska, they're all for it. And that's why we get really mad and frustrated. You saw Senator Murkowski down here a couple minutes ago. She was frustrated when the big Washington Post, New York Times, they write their left-leaning, anti-Willow, and they have no idea what they're writing about. This is a matter of life and death. And they're canceling the voices of the people I represent, particularly the Native people. So, Mr. President, that's got to change. That's got to change. You know who else supports this? I had the great honor of giving my annual speech to the Alaska legislature 2 days ago in Juneau, Alaska, something Senator Murkowski and I do every year. It's a huge honor. I made the pitch on Willow to all the state senators, state representatives, and I'm pretty sure, Mr. President, we're going to get a unanimous joint resolution from the House and Senate, Alaska State Legislature, saying how important this project is and how everybody in elected office in my state supports it. That's very unusual. Any state, you'd have outliers. Pretty sure we're going to get something unanimous. Why are we doing that? To, again, show not just the media, but the Biden administration and the Congress that this issue unifies Alaskans. And we should be respected for this. We should be respected. So the Native people of Alaska are very strongly supportive. They get canceled You even have a couple real clueless congressmen over on the other side of the Congress last week coming out saying Alaskans don't want the Willow Project, the Native people don't. I mean, these guys are clueless. I forget their names, some guy from Arizona, but they're wrong. But, Mr. President, I'm going to make another point, which is maybe even more frustrating. The media doesn't want to hear from the Native voices, but you know who else doesn't want to hear? The Biden administration themselves. The Biden administration themselves. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the president, cabinet officials, the vice president talk about racial equity, racial justice, environmental justice, all the time. Last night, I was with a remarkable gathering of Alaska Native people. This was a trilateral gathering from the people on the North Slope where this Willow Project is going to take place, right here. I call it a trilateral gathering, Mr. President, because it was the leaders, dozens of them, flew 5,000 miles from here, Utqiagvik, top of the world, by the way. They flew there 5,000 miles to Washington, D.C., and we all met last night, Senator Murkowski, Congresswoman Peltola, and it's the trilateral group, Mr. President, because it's the tribe, what we call ICAS, the Inupiat Community of the Arctic Slope. This is a regionally federally recognized tribe of Inupiat people, their leadership. So that was one part of this trilateral group. The second part was the regional borough, like a county, okay? Right here, the North Slope borough. By the way, I think it's bigger than Montana. That's the size we're talking about. These are elected officials, a city council, a mayor. They're all Inupiat indigenous people. Okay? That's the second part. And then the third part was the Alaska Native Regional Corporation, called Arctic Slope Regional Corporation. Remember, created by Congress. It's an economic engine. It has tribal and heritage components. So it was the leaders of all these three organizations, the tribe, the borough, and the regional Alaska Native Corporation, all their leadership. Mr. President, I've known these people for a long time. They are amazing, incredible Americans. You would love them. You would love them. A couple dozen of them, again, flew right here, Utqiagvik, Barrow, to Washington, D.C., okay? They wanted a meeting with the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland. They wanted a meeting with her. They didn't get the meeting. Now, you would think, geez, pretty important. You want to hear the voice of the Native people? You want to talk about racial equity, racial justice, environmental justice? These people just threw 5,000 miles to Washington, D.C. Secretary doesn't have time to meet with them? Well, that's not very respectful. They're all supportive. By the way, the tribe, they're all supportive of the Willow Project. But here's the thing, Mr. President. It wasn't just this week. This group of Alaska Natives, the trilateral group, some of the most important people in my state, have tried at least 5 different times to meet with the Secretary of Interior, have flown 5,000 miles to Washington, D.C. to get one damn meeting with the Secretary of Interior. And you know what? Her office has said no every single time. Environmental justice, racial equity, respect for the Native people. Come on. Bunch of baloney. 5 times at least. The only time Deb Haaland's ever given these people an audience is when she was up there for about 20 minutes. Shocking. Canceling the voices of the Native people of Alaska who want this project. 5,000 miles, trilateral group, the tribe, the borough, the ANC. Nope. Secretary's too busy. Nope. Secretary's too busy last time, and last time, and last time. At least 5 different times to try to meet with her. She won't listen. That's what I call cancellation. Media, you're welcome to write that. You won't, of course. I guarantee in that time she's probably met with representatives from some of these far-left radical groups, probably dozens of times, but she won't do it. Now, you want to hear some real irony, Mr. President? As I mentioned last week, the scientists came out in the federal agencies and said, here's the final environmental impact study. It was very long, very detailed, very data, scientific study. Remember, the normal course of business in the federal government, once you do an EIS, you have 30 days for the final record of decision. That almost always gets stamped approved. Rarely do you have the record of decision 30 days later changing the EIS. What's happening right now in America is all these radical lower 48 environmental groups are trying like crazy to pressure John Podesta and the President of the United States to change it. That would be pure politics. Democrats say they're party of science. This wouldn't be science at all. This would be pure, raw political power to appease the Center for Biological Diversity and completely screw the people I represent on the North Slope, okay? That would happen. But here's the real irony. Last week, BLM puts out this EIS, pretty good statement, narrowed it more, and then the Department of Interior put out a statement. They didn't attribute it to anybody. Deb Haaland certainly didn't say it was her statement. It was just a statement from the Department of Interior saying the department has substantial concerns about the Willow project. Wait a minute, BLM is part of the department. And BLM just came out with an EIS saying it was good. That's weird. And the preferred alternative in the final EIS, which BLM just put out. So that's really strange. And then they said, one of our concerns is direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions. Indirect, I don't know what that means. Deb Haaland doesn't worry about greenhouse gas emissions from New Mexico, which has increased production in oil and gas in the last 3 years by 700,000 barrels a day. Where's that story, Washington Post? But they also said they're concerned about the impacts to wildlife and Alaska Native subsistence, unquote. So they might change it based on that. But, Mr. President, who are the people who understand impacts to wildlife and Alaska Native subsistence on the North Slope? Who are they? Who are they? They're the people I was with last night. They're the people Deb Haaland refuses to meet with. So if the Department of Interior was really concerned about, quote, impacts to wildlife and Alaska Native subsistence, she had 30 Alaska Native leaders in D.C. yesterday to tell her about it. These are the whaling captains. These are the hunters. These are people who know this issue more than anybody. You know what this is, Mr. President? It's just a ruse, right? If the Department of Interior was really worried about impacts to wildlife and Alaska Native subsistence, don't you think that Deb Haaland would have taken at least one meeting with these great leaders who are the leaders on Alaska Native subsistence and wildlife? North Slope Borough probably is one of the best wildlife experts anywhere in the world. And the borough was here yesterday. Same with ICAS, the native tribe. They were here. So it's a little fishy, Mr. President. It's a little fishy that the Secretary of Interior won't meet with these great Alaska Natives. They won't. Well, I just think it's because they're going to say, Madam Secretary, respectfully, we really want this project. So, let me conclude with one other voice that's being ignored, canceled, whatever you want to talk about on the Willow project. Now, Mr. President, I like this picture. I love this picture, actually. It's a very iconic photo of men and women. No, actually, it's just all men in that photo. These are the Americans, the great Americans who built this country, right? This is a building, taking a lunch break when they're building the Empire State Building. I think they built that in 18 months, 12 months, something incredible like that. And the reason I like this picture is because There's become a theme, unfortunately. Some of my Democratic colleagues don't like it when I say this, but there's become a theme that I've seen over the years, certainly in Alaska, maybe not in the rest of the country, but I think it's pretty much the rest of the country, and it's this. My friends in the Democratic Party, they used to say, we're the party of the working men and women, the men and women who build stuff like the Empire State Building and build projects like Willow or the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. But here's the thing, Mr. President, whenever the National Democrats, Joe Biden, you name it, whenever they have a choice between the radical, far-left environmental elites who want to stop stuff and these men and women who build things, every time, every single time, they go with the radical elites and sell out the working men and women of America. Every time. Now, some of my Democratic colleagues don't like it when I say that. Well, I'm sorry, but I think it's truthful. And I will say, and I said on the floor the other day, I have a lot of Senate colleagues, Republican and in particular Democrats, and I'm so thankful, who have called and reached out to the White House and said, look, you guys, come on. This Willow project makes so much sense. It's been in permitting for decades. Every environmental review, it's passed with flying colors. The president's really going to Saudi Arabia to get on bended knee to beg for oil. He's really going to Venezuela to lift sanctions so we can get oil from them, and we're not letting Alaskans produce it? That's crazy. So a lot of my Democratic colleagues, I'm not going to name them because they probably don't want to be named, I appreciate you guys calling the White House and say, come on, you gotta approve this Willow project. But here's the thing, Mr. President. Last year I had what's called a Congressional Review Act. It was on a permitting issue. Permitting issue. The White House, believe it or not, after the infrastructure bill, which I supported, we had good permitting reform in it. After the infrastructure bill passed, the White House put out a rule that would make infrastructure projects much harder to permit, particularly energy projects. So I brought what's called a Congressional Review Act piece of legislation to rescind the Biden administration rule so we could build things more quickly. And I'm proud to say, Mr. President, a bipartisan group of senators supported me. President Biden said he was going to veto the Sullivan bill if it comes to his desk. All right, Mr. President, that's a bad idea. But the reason I'm mentioning now, that was a test, because I had every building trade in America supporting my Congressional Review Act resolution to rescind the Biden administration's arcane rule that would make permitting infrastructure projects harder. And the working men and women said, no, we're supporting the Sullivan Congressional Review Act. And guess what? It passed. Now, the usual suspects, Center for Biological Diversity, all the far-left green groups, they were against it. So that was a test. I gave a speech here. Who are you with? The working men and women of America? Or the far-left elite radical environmental groups who want to shut down everything? That's a test. I posed it to my Senate colleagues. The Senate passed the test. It was bipartisan, not by much, but it was still bipartisan. Thank you, Joe Manchin. But here's the thing, Mr. President. Willow is another test. Now, it's not a test for my colleagues here, because like I said, if we had a vote on Willow right now, I'd bet it passed well over 60, 65 senators. So again, I appreciate my Democratic colleagues who are helping me. All my Republican colleagues want this done. They know it's good for Alaska, but really good for America. But here's the thing. Once again, all the big building trades, all of them, are coming out in huge support for the Willow project. They're making it, the laborers, the building trades, they're making it one of their biggest priorities, if not their biggest priority, for these people. Why? As I mentioned, 2,500 construction jobs. That's the estimate to build this. 75% of which will be labor, building trades, union jobs. So, here's just a few of the statements from some of these great Americans, and they are great Americans. I've gotten to know these labor leaders, heart and soul of the country. Here's Terry O'Sullivan, Laborers International, LIUNA, infrastructure, energy infrastructure, oil and natural gas in particular is the largest privately funded job-creating sector for LIUNA construction workers. The oil and gas and natural gas industry has provided tens of thousands of jobs, resulting in millions of work hours for our members. These are quality union jobs with family-supporting wages and benefits. The same is true for the Willow Project. LIUNA, Terry O'Sullivan, Labor, pro-Willow. Where's that story? Washington Post, New York Times, you won't write it. You never write it. You cancel these guys. These are great Americans. How about Mark McManus? General President, journeyman apprenticeships of the Plumbing and Pipe Fitters Union. Let's see what he said about Willow. It's long past time we create good-paying union jobs and invest in North Slope, Alaska communities that will benefit directly from this project in the NPRA, as we called it. Again, NPRA set aside 70 years ago for oil and gas development. The Willow Project will help deliver reliable energy to consumers and provide billions of dollars in economic investments in these communities. There you go. Pipe fitters. Come on, national media, write that story. Just don't keep quoting the far-left environmental groups. Quote working men and women who built this nation. Who else? James Callahan, president of the operating engineers. Willow will also put operating engineers to work. Those are his union members he's in charge of. He's another great American. Along with others in the skilled trades. These jobs offers family-sustaining wages and offers strong health and pension benefits. Furthermore, construction of the Willow Project will provide much-needed revenue to Alaska and the North Slope communities, the Native communities. Another union leader in America. Now look, the president likes to call himself blue-collar Joe and working Joe and all that. Prove it, Mr. President. Prove it. This is another example of a choice. The only groups in this country right now who want to shut down the Willow Project are far-left radical environmental groups who don't want to build anything, who don't give a darn about working men and women in America, and who certainly don't give a darn about the Native community on the North Slope. I really wish our media friends will write this story. The unions support it, quote them. The Native people support it, quote them. Don't cancel them. And this administration needs to wake up. The American people are getting tired of this. This is a test. The EIS came out last week. If it is changed, it will be because a raw political party by far-left environmental groups who forced the White House to kill this project. I'm just going to end with this, Mr. President. This is just an example. These are union members. These are a broad-based group of Alaska Native organizations. These are just economic groups in our state and nationally. This is not a hard call. This project has the highest environmental standards in the world. And if we need oil and gas, which we do, why wouldn't we get it from American workers, like the people I just quoted? To help Alaska Native communities, like the people I just quoted. Why is the federal government and Joe Biden going to Saudi Arabia to beg for oil? By the way, he got rejected. Why did we lift sanctions on Venezuela, a terrorist regime, to get more oil, whose production processes are 18 times more polluting than an American oil and gas project? Why? None of this makes sense. So, Mr. President, again, I want to thank my Democratic Senate colleagues in particular. We got 30 days. And if you're an American and you care about energy security and good jobs, you're a union member, Pick up the phone, send an email, blm.gov, and tell them, stop the madness. Finalize the Willow project for the benefit of the native people in Alaska, for the benefit of working Americans, for the benefit of our national security, for the benefit of our environment. That's what we need to do. I'm hoping that the Biden administration makes the right call. I yield the floor.